Put on your bifocals, bitch. You're about to read history. For filth! Hey there, it's Kiki Tahihi, drag Herstorian with a master's in nothing and PhD. You're listening to Reading Glasses, podcast for the queer nerd, keen to critique the shit out of the historical contingencies and social constructs that determine the social consciousness of today. Say it again, you say? Our social consciousness is 2, 4, 6, 8, historically contingent and socially constructed. That's right, gird your loins, ladies. The way we see the world is defined by available concepts, categories, and methods. You know when you've got the one lipstick shade you stole from your mother, sister, or Sephora?
Security.
Either you get an outfit to match or try to convince yourself that it goes with every outfit. History is pretty much the same thing, but instead of ending up with a kind of cute outfit, you have things like slavery, capitalism, but also money. Today's outfit on Reading Glasses is sexual deviance and non-binary identification in the Philippines. We're gonna find out what lipstick shade color-blocked that social order. Time to time travel back to pre-colonial Philippines. Jingy, they wouldn't speak English, so I guess I'll have to conduct academic research.
Boo, you whore.
According to A History of the Philippines from Indios Bravos to Filipinos by Luis Francia, there were no native counterparts to sexual orientation in pre-colonial Philippines. What? That's right, gender and sexuality are 2, 4, 6, 8, historically contingent and socially constructed. For example, local shamans, often women or cross-dressing males, would have a lot of influence over a community as the seer. They do a lot of things. See, prescribe ailments to individuals, just like my weed man. But these individuals thought they were sick because they were hexed, just like my weed man. Most saliently, they provided military strategy for the male combatants because they could apparently tell the future. Indeed, for women and cross-dressing males to have so much influence, and for that influence not to differ between cross-dressers and biological women, shows that 1. Social roles related to gender, sex, and sexuality were not hierarchical, and 2. Indigenous people not only practiced non-binary modes of gender expression, but they helped propagate their own social order, the barangay. A small enclave of up to 80 people. The social status within a barangay would be determined not by gender, sex, or sexuality necessarily, but by their utility to the barangay. Social functions were not innate by any means, or even perceived as such. Local shaman would be very powerful, but ruling elite would also include other people who could ensure the survival of the barangay through combat or sickening leadership. Granted, combatant roles would often be fulfilled by men, but power relations were incredibly flexible and context-dependent. Even if gendered categories existed, they did not necessarily result in the advantage that males have today. Sucks for male privilege! The parameters of a barangay would mostly depend on blood relations, on both sides. Men and women were pretty much equal. Women would not belong to men as a result of marriage. Monogamy wasn't even a thing. Neither was polygamy because indigenous Filipinos were polyamorous AF and sex positive. The barangay was also like an extended family. Blood pacts were popular to formalize alliances between individuals who were not blood related. Kinship was strong no matter the relationship. In fact, social roles within the barangay were so collectivized that people didn't even own property. They were all shareholders who could profit from land use under a system called bayanihan, approximately translating to communal solidarity. Well, what happened? When did queer become a thing, Mama? Child, let me recap. In pre-colonial Philippines, generally biological sex did not necessarily determine quote-unquote gender and its subsequent social role. 2. Indebtedness, not marriage or gender, was a currency of social status. 3. The bayanihan, the communal economic institution, was robust enough to support a barangay.
Everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
Which brings me to my first set of primary sources. I have for you one of the first documented impressions of Filipino people by incoming Spanish people. Taken directly from the Boxer Codex, a Spanish manuscript describing the people and customs of Luzon, the northern end of Philippines. Since I cannot do a Spanish accent, I will instead do an accent inspired by Lieutenant Aldo Rain from Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds. Indians dressed as women ordinarily act like prudes and are so effeminate that one who does not know them would believe that they are women. Almost all are impotent for the reproductive act, and thus they marry other males and sleep with them as man and wife and have carnal knowledge. This source tells me three things. That, firstly, the author holds preconceived notions of what women should act like. Words like prude, effeminate, and impotent are not empirically sound. Secondly, the author is not afraid to talk indelicately about the sexual relation between man and woman, but also between two menses. This is probably not the point of view from a religious missionary. Instead of saying the Spanish colonial equivalent to "these men collude in sodomy," he effectively says, very matter-of-factly, that Indians dressed as women know what his man feels like. Perhaps the English translation of the text bears little similarity to the connotations of its original Spanish text, but the vivid description is pretty denotative. Me and me means the same thing denotatively, even though connotatively one might represent daddy issues more than the other. Similarly, by saying things like prude, effeminate, and impotent, he's projecting his own understandings of how biological males should act, how sex affects gender expression and sexuality. This goes to show that sexual deviance is a construct relative to a norm, y'all, and that norm is 2, 4, 6, 8, historically contingent and socially constructed. Contact with Spanish colonizers was one of the seeds from which contemporary normative structures regarding sexuality and gender in the Philippines were sown. But colonization didn't just bitch slap indigenous people with their notions of sexual deviance and gender norms.
Heteronormativity, bitch!
Indigenous people must have opted into the social order and benefited in other ways. Remember when I said indebtedness was a currency for social status? Unfortunately, due to the economic and social profits from colonial orders, social functions became innate under the same scheme of indebtedness. Spanish missionaries projected their homophobia and misogyny, but the indigenous Filipinos incorporated it into its cultural script. According to my second secondary source, Contracting Colonialism, Translation and Christian Conversion in Tagalog Society under Early Spanish Rule by Rafael Vicente A. Indigenous people had a lot to gain from absorbing the Catholic values that so directly contradicted their own social religious order. For example, shamanism did have a lot of influence over the community, but Catholicism just seemed more legit with its rituals like sacraments. Compared to shamans who gave advice at discretion, sacraments were a transparent spiritual currency to exchange for God's gifts. As per Thomistic theology, they affect what they signify. They are signs that cause what they signify, and cause by signifying. In basic people speak, it's a circular logic. Catholicism was like an ATM for God's good, but God's good was the ATM. But shamanism was more like a piggy bank you weren't sure could open. Not to mention that participating in colonial social orders meant major economic gains on the side. Money, trade, spice, gold. Think of Wolf of Wall Street colonial edition. Under the same pragmatism indigenous people practiced, participating in mercantilist trade brought affluence. Trade settlements already existed in barangay around the lowlands. Spanish colonials just expanded an existing trade network and offered their own exports. But, like Spanish colonization itself, Their coinciding social orders, like gender norms, only influenced the barangay with which colonizers sought economic, political, or social One source argues that this influence still differs along geographic lines. Lowland Filipinos in the 16th century had more in common with highland minorities, according to this source. That differentiation didn't stop sexual deviance and non binary identification, even at the tail end of colonialism. At the butt of colonialism, academics could not escape these colonial structures of thought. Take, for example, Jose Rizal. He's pretty cool, I guess. Filipino national hero, apparently. He's kind of like the Alexander Hamilton of Spanish colonial Philippines because he advocated for political reforms. Except Rizal was executed before actual Philippine independence. He also wasn't that cool to the sexually deviant and non-binary identifying. For my second secondary source, I bring to you Jose Rizal's annotation of a journal by Spanish historian Antonio de Morga. Regarding de Morga's comment that natives practice the depraved and sinful offense against nature or sodomy, Rizal responded, not disagreeing with de Morga's negative portrayal of homosexuality. In fact, he perpetuated those notions and said sodomy, doing it in the butt, was a crime. Listen up! This is an important distinction. Here, Rizal conflates sodomy's religious implications and discusses potential legal implications for the first time. The categories of sexual deviance begins overlapping with political structures of justice and punishment. Thus began the clash of social orders, the dissonance between different orders of categorizing sexual deviance and non-binary identification. Colonial and post-colonial structures incorporating elements of Catholicism became incredibly repressive towards sexual deviance because its deviance is now seen as negative. Not natural, but somehow innate to people who commit these acts. The geographic and political decentralization of these social orders, however, have helped maintain the pre-colonial variability of gender and sexual deviance into the 20th century. Spanish colonization ends in 1898, but in the 20th century, Catholicism is still Catholicism. Academia still reinforces colonial attitudes, and popular culture resists but also reinforces top-down persecution of sexual deviance and non-binary identification. The quote-unquote psychological and quote-unquote scientific and quote-unquote academic quote-unquote institutions in the early 20th century reinforced post-colonial social consciousness, hence the quote-unquotes. While scientists would study sexual deviance and non-binary identification, they would not be critical of the colonial institutions that would inform their analyses. From the Journal of Social Psychology in the early 20th century, bakla refers to transvestites or effeminate homosexuals, also used to refer to boys who are simply less active than others in games and outdoors activities. Side note, I don't like to run. Anyways, the quote shows the persistence of colonial conflations of gender, sex, and sexuality. This psychologist's definition of bakla is contingent on preconceptions of femininity, apparently less athletic activity. Then he introduces sexual deviance in the scaffold of apparent gender expression. In basic people speak, being gay in Filipino culture means to be biologically male but also expressively feminine. There's an entirely different word for female homosexuals, tomboy, but there isn't even a word for very masculine homosexuals. Since gender binarism and heteronormativity, as enforced by Spanish Catholics, had political ramifications, being perceived as criminal and persecuted as such, the political ramifications reinforce those same categories. Currently, the overlaps between biological sex and gender expression are most critical attributes for models of sexual deviance in the Philippines, which are boy, girl, bakla, and tomboy, all mutually exclusive. To be a boy, you must be biologically male but comply with popular notions of masculinity. To be a girl, you must be biologically female but comply with popular notions of femininity. To be bakla, you must be biologically male but feminine. To be tomboy, you must be biologically female but masculine. A movie was released in 2013 called Boy Girl Bakla Tomboy, and If these notions weren't openly practiced before, this movie only serves to confirm these notions. It was one of the highest grossing films in Philippine history. Gender and sexuality, as well as sexual deviance and non-binary gender, all labels that are 2, 4, 6, 8 historically contingent and socially constructed. Concepts are all lipstick shades that we've stolen from our mothers, who might have stolen it from their mothers, who might have gotten it in a color set from a pre-colonial Sephora. These concepts mean different things to different people, resulting in an evolution in their connotation. The persistence and popularity of these concepts depend more on their utility for social influence and its validity. For indigenous Filipinos, it was communal solidarity. For Spanish colonizers, it was their definition of justice. But the time we reach the 20th century, the world can only be seen in a color shaded in the lipsticks of the past. Yet they continue to have consequences on the outfits of the future. I'm really milking this metaphor.